In this bass lesson, you'll learn that when you're creating your own bass lines, scales are not a great way to do it. Hi, I'm Luke from Become a Bassist, and if you want to know how to create bass lines using two much more useful tools than just scales, stick around. Every once in a while, I'll get a question from an email subscriber basically asking, how do you use scales to make bass lines? And I always give roughly the same response. I usually say that using scales isn't a really good way to make bass lines. Why not? Well, the reality is that most bass lines aren't built with a particular scale in mind. The scales that bass lines sometimes fit into are usually just a convenient distraction from two other things that bass lines are really built around. And those two things are outlining the chords of a song and making the bass line a strong melodic idea all by itself. And even then, a strong melodic idea will often outline the chords of a song anyway. Now, I'm not saying that you can't make bass lines from scales, because you absolutely can. However, when you look at the majority of great bass lines, you'll find that they aren't just kind of going up and down scales. I mean, those might be useful technical exercises, but it doesn't exactly make for kind of very good music. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. For example, blues scales and pentatonics get used in songs all the time in a very kind of scalar way, but these are kind of a bit different than the major scales and the modes and all those kind of ones that I'm focusing on right now. Because even when bass lines are just going straight up and down these full scales, it's usually still to outline chords. For example, if you know Nina Simone's version of My Baby Just Cares For Me, you'll know the bass line goes like this. This is just an A major descending scale, right? In fact, it goes all the way from the root at the top and plays every other note of the A major scale. So this bass line, it must have been written from the major scale, right? And I mean, that is definitely possible. But if you listen to the track as a whole, if you look at the bigger picture, you'll hear these chords going by. You've got A major, F sharp minor, D major, and E major. And you'll hear that in the bass line. You'll hear F sharp D to E. Yeah, right when you get to those chords. So even though this bass line is using a scale, it's using the scale to support the chords that it's being played under. The scale, it's kind of incidental. Another example is Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song. Everyone kind of knows the kind of famous riff, but when we get to, I guess you'd call the chorus, we get this kind of line from John Paul Jones. So slow down, it looks like this. And that's absolutely just an A mixed Lydian scale ascending. Then we get the same thing on B. And then we get the same thing on C mixed Lydian. And then if you want to get really fancy with some kind of terminology, it ends on a C dominant bebop scale. Yeah? Now meanwhile, the guitar is playing these power chords. They play over the A mixed Lydian, we're playing an A power chord, over the B mixed Lydian, B power chord, and C power chord over the C mixed Lydian. And even though the bass lines use these scales, it's to support the chords, the harmony, as well as that kind of melody underneath everything. If the bass line had just been the roots of the chords, something like that, the bass line would have been just as functional, but maybe a little bit less interesting with a bit less movement. By the way, I racked my brain to try and think of more, but these two examples are the only two bass lines I could think of that play a full scale from top to bottom or bottom to top in this way, outside of the pentatonic or the blues scales. There are probably more examples, and if you know any offhand, let me know in the comments section underneath this video. I'd love to hear from you. My point though, is that even these bass lines that are as scalar as possible, they aren't just using scales for the sake of using scales. They use scales to help outline the harmony, the chords of the song. If you really want to use scales to make your bass line and really kind of lean on them in this way, then you really need to be picking scales that outline chords, and you need to play those scales in a way that helps outline those chords. So that was two examples of scalar bass lines, but let's now look at two super iconic bass lines, and you'll see that while they might fit nicely into certain scales, that's not really the point. First of all, a bass line I'm sure you've heard before, John Deacon's bass line on Queen's Another One Bites the Dust. The main part sounds like this. Now this is just 3 notes, and those 3 notes could be part of dozens of scales. The notes E, A, and G, they can be found in the keys of C major, G major, D major, F major, plus all of their relative minors, so that's 8 keys, plus all of the modes from all of these keys, so if each one has 7 modes, then you end up with 56 possible kind of answers for what key these notes are a part of. So when you look at these notes in isolation, they really don't tell you much about the key or the potential scales that they can be a part of, right? But you'll notice that when you listen, you can very easily hear harmony and very easily hear chords even in these 3 notes. The E is the strongest of the notes, so that first chord is probably some kind of E chord. Our second note is a G, so that means that our E chord is probably going to be some kind of E minor chord. Now why? It's because that if it was an E major chord, then we'd expect to hear a G sharp here instead of a G. But we get the G, so it's probably going to be a minor chord. Now our last note, which kind of hangs in the air a little bit, you can make a good argument for another chord at the end there, which is some kind of A chord. And by the way, if you listen to the whole track, when Brian May comes in on guitar, what does he play? He plays E minor and A minor chords. This bass line is a melody, it outlines harmony, and it does it all with just 3 notes, hardly a scale at all. And even when we get to the next part, all of that outlines harmony as well. You're getting a C chord, going to a G chord, you get that 3 times, and then you get the A minor chord, going to a B chord right there. Everything is outlining harmony, everything is outlining a chord. Another great example of a melodic line that outlines chords is Gorilla's Feel Good Inc. Now in case you don't know it, it sounds like this. Now the actual original is tuned down a half step, but just to keep things easy, we're kind of staying in standard tuning. If you look at the actual notes of the line, almost all of the notes of an E minor scale are in there. The only note that's missing is a D. So it's got all the notes except that one right there. So it's got all the notes of this scale, but does this bass line sound like a scale when it's played? No, it doesn't sound like a scale, it's just a really cool line. By the way, this bass line also outlines chords as well. Check it out. You've got an E minor chord going to B, then A minor, going back to E minor. That's what I'm hearing when that bass line starts. It's got that strong E to start, and then it kind of really hangs on the B. So you've got the B minor, and then the strong A at the start of the next bar, back to the E there. Yeah, so E, B minor, A minor, E minor. Again, this bass line is absolutely outlining chords, and while the notes might fall nicely into an E minor scale, there's not really any point in the line where more than 3 consecutive scale notes are played in the way that you would play them for a scale exercise. It's all about the bass line melody and the harmony it creates. It's sort of a common thing with bass players who are in the midst of learning their scales. They get all this knowledge of scales, so when they try and create bass lines, they try and attach a scale to everything, and it can end up sounding like a very academic exercise rather than a really cool song. Now I'm sure that's not something that you want for yourself, so to make sure you create bass lines that sound like real songs rather than exercises, I've made a very special resource for you. It's called the Basslines from Scratch Checklist. Inside, you'll find a super helpful list of questions you can ask yourself about the bass lines that you've created. If your bass line is up to scratch, you'll be able to breeze through the checklist no worries and know that your line is great. If not, it'll tell you exactly what to do to improve it. The checklist is 100% free, and to get it, just click the first link in the description, sign up on that page, and I'll send it straight to you, as well as the tabs and notation for all the bass lines we talked about in this lesson, and all the other lessons of bass lines from scratch as well. To recap though, you learned that while it is possible to make bass lines from scales, I'd encourage you to think in those 2 other terms, outlining chords and the harmony of the song, or thinking in terms of your bass line as a melodic idea. You got two kind of rare examples of scale-based lines that explicitly outline the chords of a song using scales, and of course two examples of non-scale-based lines that did basically the same thing without ever explicitly going up and down or down a scale. Thank you so much for watching. It's been great having you with me. Hopefully I'll see you in the next Basslines from Scratch video and in the checklist as well. I'm Luke from Become a Bassist, and I'll catch you in another video soon.